Well, hello everyone. This is Joe Brewer, your host for the webinar today. I'm really excited to see how many of you are here. I know that this is a strange time when more of us are at home than normal because of what's happening in the world. And we're really excited today because the webinar is focused on how to cooperate more effectively, which is clearly something that we're going to need to get very good at in the coming weeks, months, and years. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Brewer. I'm your host today. This webinar is part of a series for the Earth Regenerator Study Group, which you can join by clicking on the button just below the video where it says Join Our Study Group. These webinars and the study group are completely free, so I'm just glad to have you all here. And this is the 5th one in a series. So all of the previous webinars, and this one too, are recorded and can be watched afterwards. So if you like what happens in this one, I encourage you to go back and see some of the others. What we're going to talk about today is really practical, really important, and also really timely, because we're going to talk about how to create better cooperation in groups. And we're going to put it in the context of how to regenerate the entire planet. So we're going to be talking about something fairly focused about human development and group capacity, while keeping in mind that we want to employ this for dealing with some of the most challenging, unprecedented, and urgent predicaments that our species has ever faced. So one thing I'd like to share before we get going is that there is an option at the bottom of the screen that says Ask a Question. At any time that you would like to ask a question, you can go there and post one, type it in. And I'm going to be having a period of this webinar with some presentation. So you can post questions in the Ask a Question box while I'm presenting. And then what's going to happen afterwards is everyone can vote for the questions they most want to hear answered. And I will invite the person who asked the questions into a shared video screen for us to discuss them. And what's really nice about this is it lets us pose questions and have the ability to answer the questions that the most people would like to answer, and doing them in the order of most people wanting it answered to less people wanting it answered. And at any time, you can ask a question and put it in that box. Also, as many of you are already doing in the chat box on the side, we have found in previous webinars that people start parallel conversations there, sharing links and information, and very rich learning happens in the chat box. So I want to encourage you to use the chat box to talk with others in the group. And as of right now, we have 167 people registered, and my internal statistics show 71 people are actively in the webinar at the moment. So there'll be a lot of opportunity for interaction with each other using the chat box. So our format today is really simple. I'm going to share a presentation where I will be introducing the framework of prosocial and talking about how to create healthy functioning groups so that people can cooperate better together. We'll also be talking about human development and how to increase our capacities to cooperate as individuals so that groups become better functioning and the individuals within them become better functioning at the same time. And so we're going to have a presentation period that I think will last about 30 minutes, maybe 35 minutes, because I have a few more slides than normal. And during that time is when you can pose questions in the Ask a Question box. Then I'm going to end the presentation and we'll begin an extended discussion and Q&A period where we'll have a lot more opportunity to interact with each other. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right into the presentation and get started. And like I said, feel free to use the chat box to discuss ideas with each other and to share links to help people dive more deeply into topics that we'll be discussing, and pose your questions using the Ask a Question button that's at the bottom of the screen. All right, with that in mind, let's get started with the presentation. I'm really excited that all of you are here, so thank you for coming. All right, are we sharing screen now? Here it goes. Oh, I don't want to stop sharing. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. What I wanted to do is actually hide the button that gives us a message on the front of the screen. So now here, and I'm going to hide this button. Now I'm ready. Okay, so let's get started. What I want to do today is share with you that Our topic is how to regenerate our capacities to cooperate, and I use that phrasing very intentionally, which is that historically humans have been very good cooperators, as we'll see in the presentation, and in the last few decades, we've actually become a lot worse at cooperating, and we need to bring those capacities back. So there are latent human potentials for cooperation that we're not meeting our potential in this regard. And we need to be meeting it because we need to regenerate the earth. And so we want to direct these capacities toward this larger goal, which is urgently upon us. Now, for those of you who remember in previous webinars that I've used the planetary boundaries framework as a way of organizing our higher level thinking. Our goal today is to talk about cooperation in groups, but what I want to share is that there are these 9 planetary boundaries that if any of them are crossed, then our planetary civilization becomes jeopardized and human extinction becomes possible. As of right now, we've crossed 4 of them. So when I talk about cooperating to regenerate the earth, we're talking about dealing with climate change. We're talking about ending the extinction of species. We're talking about addressing the ways that we change the landscapes of our planet by destroying ecosystems and replacing them with simplified human management systems or degraded land. And we're talking about the flows of chemicals and other things that come from human activities that are overwhelming the Earth system at present. We need to be cooperating to address these planetary scale phenomena, and this is going to require a lot of coordinated effort. Specifically, what needs to happen is we need to somehow recreate the conditions for living locally as human beings. And this is in terms of all the material flows of our economies, the supply chains, the sourcing of materials, where our waste streams go and all of that. The integration of human culture with the larger ecosystems and the life of non-human species. And the thriving of families and communities within the human world and the non-human world. And we need to do this across all of the bioregions of the planet. So this is something that is going to require a huge amount of cooperation. So in the Earth Regenerators group, we've been talking about creating a network of bioregional economies, each of which works to regenerate its landscapes while creating community resilience at the same time. This is what we're going to direct cooperation toward. And as you've probably guessed from our current track record, humanity is not doing a very good job. We have very few bioregional economies, even in nascent form. We have very poor community resilience in most parts of the world, and we have deeply degraded landscapes and threatened patterns of destabilization. So we have an urgent need to get better at cooperating around shared purposes as it relates to these regenerative bioregions. So with that in mind, let's talk about cooperation. In one of the earlier webinars, when I talked about cultural evolution and how it relates to our planetary predicament, I made this provocative claim that what if the behavioral flexibility of human beings is the root cause of the Earth's ecological crisis? And as we discussed in that webinar, it was the human ability to change our behavior in ways that further degraded environments that created this cumulative cascading effect of harming the entire planet and placing our species in jeopardy. But the reverse is also true. It is our ability to change our behavior individually and collectively that is the pathway to our salvation. So we have to understand how we get from these polarized, conflict-ridden, fragmented contexts of human relationships and somehow intentionally guide the evolution of our cultures so that we can work together as healthy people with healthy relationships while at the same time creating more healthy environments. And this is our work. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the details of how to do this. At a broad level, what evolutionary biologists have learned in the last 100 years is that the history of life on Earth, which goes back roughly 3.8 billion years, has given rise to a huge, splendid diversity of social organization. Each time that there are ants interacting in a colony, as you see on the left, or individual yeast cells that are functioning as a slime mold, as individual single-celled organisms, creating complex structures in the bottom right. Each time these different kinds of social organization come into being, there is some kind of cooperation going on. The question for us is, what are the conditions for this cooperation? When cooperation is present and it's working, how do we know that it's working? If it's not working or it's not present, how do we know what's missing? If we want to design our way to higher levels of cooperation, then we need to know what these criteria are. And it turns out they're known, as we'll see in a moment. Also, when we look at the patterns of interaction between living things, like this school of fish that's in a giant swarm in the upper right, or this murmuration, which is a self-organizing pattern of birds all flying together as they navigate the sky, that a kind of collective intelligence can emerge when the interactions are aligned with collective intelligence. But as we've seen plenty of times, and you can simply look at most of our political conversations in the world right now, we are not achieving collective intelligence because we have the wrong patterns of interaction. So we need to know what those patterns are if we're going to successfully regenerate the Earth. Now, I want to primarily focus on two pieces of work in today's webinar. One is the prosocial framework, and this wonderful book that I highly recommend is a great place to learn more. We're going to talk about prosocial, but you can actually go to the prosocial.world website and apply for a deeper training to become certified, and also to form groups using their online tools. So what I'm going to give you is an overview of what they cover in much greater depth, and I definitely encourage you to go there. We're also going to talk about this distinct book, The Nordic Secret, which talks about a model of human development that enabled the first democracies to arise a little more than 100 years ago. And these are going to be our primary pillars for the discussion today. But as you can see on the right, there are a lot of other books, and this is just a tiny sampling, a lot of other books and resources about how cooperation works and what its conditions are that you can dig into. And you can always ask questions in the study group or in the chat box for more references to some of those materials. But today we're going to focus primarily on prosocial and this Nordic Secret. First thing I want to say, and this comes from a quote by Herb Gintis, who is an ecological economist and a behavioral ecologist. So he studies human behavior from an evolutionary lens in the context of human cultures. And he has made this sweeping claim that the fundamental adaptation for human beings that has enabled our species to thrive and survive in so many different contexts is our ability to have teamwork. We work in teams like no other organism that has ever existed. And we need to understand how to form effective teams and how to make those teams even better as they interact with other teams so that we can scale our collective impacts from local all the way to planetary. So if our fundamental adaptation is teamwork, that means we have a lot of innate ability, and all we need to do is build our competency. We need to practice the skills of teamwork because we have the human natural evolved ability to work well in teams. So let's work on that. How can we increase our competency in being team members? And this is where the prosocial framework comes into play. Now, prosocial is unlike other frameworks because it's actually a blend of several frameworks, and it's built on a huge integration of research across different related fields of study. And there is a coherence across this research that shows us that each of the parts is correct because it is consistent with other parts that are correct. Now, the three foundational pillars of prosocial are the core design principles for managing the commons, which we'll discuss in a moment, a field of behavioral science and public health research called contextual behavioral science that combines behavioral studies with cognitive science, with therapy, with organizational management, and then the general study for the evolution of cooperation in living systems for human and non-human species. When you take this huge array of knowledge and put it together and ask what is coherent among this knowledge, the prosocial framework emerges. And what you're going to see as we continue is that the insights from prosocial can be combined with other tools and frameworks. So for example, if you like to use sociocracy, or if you're an entrepreneur who creates businesses using shared equity, or if you've created a B Corp, a benefit corporation, and you want to know how to balance purpose with profit, whatever the framework is that you're using, you're going to find the insights from prosocial will apply to your framework, because the research is about how the world works, not about a specific framework being better than another. And that's what's so powerful about this. As we go through the prosocial framework, we're going to learn the design criteria for cooperation. And that design criteria applies regardless of the framework that you're using. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start by looking at what are called the core design principles for managing the commons. Well, there's a wonderful woman, a political scientist named Elinor Ostrom. She passed away about 10 years ago, just after being the first woman in history to get the Nobel Prize in economics. As a political scientist, she studied how different human groups would manage what she called common pooled assets. Common pooled assets are things that are shared in common and need to be managed together by a group of people. A very easy example to understand is if there's grazing land and there are different people who say have goats or cattle, and they need to put those goats and cattle onto the grazing land, then the land itself is the common pooled asset. But what's interesting is that there are many kinds of commons. So if you're on a basketball team or a football or soccer team, your team, as it works toward winning the game, is a common pooled asset. If you're using a platform together that involves a currency, like using Bitcoin, or if you're using holochain to store your data, or other technology-enabled communities, the technology and the community are common pooled assets. So it turns out that this is a general finding for a lot of things. What's really important about Elinor Ostrom's work is she identified 8 criteria. Every time a group of people is managing their commons and it's working, all 8 criteria are met. If it's not working, at least one of these criteria is not met. Now, I want to stress at the beginning that this is not a reductionistic model. These 8 criteria interact with each other in dynamic and complex ways, which is why you need all of them working to be able to manage a commons. And just as a little aside comment, as David Sloan Wilson, who's one of the creators of prosocial, he likes to say, every group of humans is a commons. So if you form a group, your group is a common pooled asset, and you better be sure it meets these 8 criteria. So with that in mind, let's get started. The first core design principle identified by Elinor Ostrom is that if you have a common pooled asset, you need to have a group with shared identity and purpose. Now here I have a picture of these 4 rowers in the same boat, where the boat creates a beautiful container of what the shared identity is. If you're in the boat, the identity applies to you. If you're not in the boat, the identity does not. So shared identity is about knowing who's a member of the group and who is not. Now, if they're in a group, everyone in the group needs to understand, what is this group for? What are we doing together? If you cannot answer the question, who are we in this group and what are we here to do, then your group is not going to work very well. And you can see with non-human examples that these leaf cutter ants are climbing up to collect parts of this plant, that they have a shared identity as actually kin members. They're members of the same genetic family. They're all daughters of the same queen, and that their purpose is to collect the leaves as a food supply. They have shared identity and purpose as a team. So this is really important. And I am sure all of us have experienced times when we were in a group that did not clarify what it means to be a member, how a person becomes a member, who is not a member, and what the purpose of the group is in the first place. This is so fundamental, so important, and surprisingly often, it's neglected. So you need to know this to have a functioning group. The second core design principle is you need to have an equitable way of sharing based on contributions and benefits. Another way of saying this is if there are people in the group who do more of the work, Those people either should get more of the benefits, or they should feel like they are getting other ways of being benefited that do not require them to directly get what they helped create. So it's not that it's always equal, that everyone gets the same amount. Sometimes some members of the group do more and they deserve more of the benefits. And if you don't create this sense of equity in how the benefits are distributed and how the contributions are understood, what happens is resentment can fester, inequality can emerge, and it can undermine the shared identity and the shared purpose of the group. So we can already see that design principle number 2 relates to the design principle number 1. And we've all been in groups where we did a lot of work and someone else got more of the benefit and we felt it was unfair, and it undermined our ability and our motivation to contribute to that group. So this is an extremely important part of managing any commons. The third core design principle is fair and inclusive decision-making. How does the group make decisions, for example, about how to allocate those benefits, or how to change the rules for who becomes a member and who is not? Or sometimes you need to kick a member of the group out because they're behaving in a way that's disruptive to the group. How do you define those rules? What are the protocols for making those rules? And do all of the members feel like they can participate in changing the rules? This is the foundation of democracy, but it's actually the foundation of any effective management. Anyone who has been involved in managing another group of people will know that if you have an authoritarian top-down way of just telling people what the decisions are, you will eventually corrode and undermine the sense of shared identity. The members of the group will feel like you are an outside elitist and that they are a separate group, and your one group will become two because you did not have fair and inclusive decision-making. So this is an extremely important way of maintaining coherence, shared purpose, motivation, and good morale within a group. Core design principle number 4 is that you have to have some way of deciding what the behaviors are that everyone wants for the group, what the behaviors are that everyone doesn't want for the group, and then having some way transparently and accountably monitoring those behaviors. Now in these pictures, I'm showing you something called the good behavior game, which is based in the same contextual behavioral science as prosocial. And what they've managed to do is create a model for elementary school children to govern their own classroom. And they have this 4-part framework that they call see, hear, feel, do. And this is a list that the children come up with together. What are the behaviors we want to see more of? What are the sounds and actions that we want to hear more of? What are the feelings that we'd like to feel more of as we're part of the group? And what are the behaviors we want to see people doing? And you can see that this implies their opposite. If we want to see more cooperative behavior, then we want to see less selfish and greedy behavior. If we want to hear more giggling and happy play, then we want to hear less angry yelling and argument. You see how this see, hear, feel, do is a way for the children in the classroom to monitor the behaviors that they've agreed to. And by putting it on the wall, you can always stop the class for a moment and say, do we remember what we agreed to? Here are the behaviors right here. And if the group does not have a way of transparently monitoring these behaviors and then creating appropriate consequences, then the group can quickly devolve, meaning it can go from higher functioning to lower functioning simply because people are not helping to encourage the behaviors that everyone wants. So this ability to monitor the agreed behaviors is of fundamental importance. Core design principle number 5 is that you need what is called graduated responding. All that means is that when you see a small behavior that's unhelpful, you have a small consequence. If you see a big behavior that's unhelpful, you have a bigger consequence. And I want to use an example that comes from the work of Christopher Boehm, and you can read about it in this book, Moral Origins. Christopher Boehm asked the question, how did human hunter-gatherer societies, how did they become egalitarian? And what he found by studying all of the ethnographic research that he could find from more than 100 different cultural studies of different hunter-gatherer societies is that there were 3 levels of consequences for antisocial behavior. The first was that if someone is doing something like they come back from a hunt and they keep more food for themselves and they don't share it with the rest of the community, so they're being a little selfish, that the group can actually, while they're sitting in story time, they can tell a story that spreads in the story. It tells about a person who's behaving badly and does it in a way that everyone knows we're talking about the greedy hoarding behavior of this one person. So this ability to use gossip to talk about good behavior and bad behavior within the group can help give gentle feedback to someone who's not behaving in a prosocial way. But sometimes that doesn't work and the person keeps engaging in the bad behavior. So they can actually raise the stakes, where if the person is consistently behaving badly and doing things that are undermining the group, then it's possible to temporarily kick that person out or permanently ostracize them if the behavior is really severe. And this is a lot more significant of a consequence than simply spreading rumors or redirecting their behavior with feedback and stories about ethical behavior. Now, sometimes, because we know they exist, there might be a sociopathic serial killer that lives in the hunter-gatherer society. And this person is dangerous and actually kills some members of the group. And so these lower levels of consequences don't actually work. What Christopher Bohm found was that in extreme cases, while it was rare, it was still evident that sometimes the group would agree that they needed to execute the dangerous person. And they would actually come together as a group and enact capital punishment. Now, the important thing for us is that this has a basis in many different cultures through cross-cultural anthropological research. But for the sake of Elinor Ostrom's work, you can clearly see that there are different levels of responding to helpful and unhelpful behaviors, and that this has been fundamental for hunter-gatherer societies to become egalitarian. So it applies for all groups, and all human groups are going to need to have these different levels of responding. Core design principle number 6 says that when there are conflicts, because conflicts always arise, they need to have fast and fair ways of resolving them. So if you don't have clear procedures for who is the neutral person or group that will manage the conflict, if you don't have ways of resolving it quickly before it can fester and grow, and if the outcomes of the conflict resolution are not understood to be fair, then all of this will undermine shared identity and purpose and undermine the ability for people to participate in the group. So it's extremely important to have fast and fair conflict resolution. Core design principle number 7 says that each group needs to be able to govern itself. That means they're making their own decisions, that the boundary of their group overlaps with the common pooled asset that they need to manage. And we have seen so many examples where the jurisdiction of some legal entity is not aligned with the thing that needs to be managed. So there might be a watershed, for example, that crosses the border between the United States and Canada. So there are two nations, each with their own authority to govern, and the watershed itself does not have the authority for people to make decisions across the national boundary. So this alignment of the thing to be managed and the structure of the group itself is extremely important. And this is why I talk so much about bioregions as a way of organizing human communities, where our systems of management and decision-making need to map to the landscapes that we're trying to manage, or else the common pooled assets will become degraded. And that's what's called, by Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons. So whether the self-governing is the swarming behavior of a bunch of birds, the early formation of democracy as a nation state is forming, or the creation of a bioregional management system for a watershed or some other landscape-based model of organization, the management system needs to be able to self-govern. Now here's the real kicker. When you look at core design principle number 8, what it basically says is the other 7 principles need to apply to all groups that your group interacts with. So if you are in say a school board, you need to be able to work with your city council. Your city council needs to work with your regional planning authority, and so on. If you have collaborative relationships between the groups, those collaborative relationships themselves are a commons, and they need to meet all 7 of the principles mentioned before. What I want to say with the Iroquois Nation, and the reason I put this picture here, is that the Iroquois Nation, which was a collaboration of 5 different but related tribes across New England, was actually the primary inspiration for the tripartite government of the United States that separated the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. And this way of creating a shared framework of collaboration that is a common pooled asset is how you can scale upward and scale downward. My team works well because it works well, but my team needs to work well with your team, so we need to have a commons framework for how our teams form a commons and work well together. And this is how we can scale upward and scale downward from local activities to regional activities to planetary activities. There's a fractal nature to these design principles. And what's really interesting is, as you can see from these 8 core design principles, that you can use them as diagnostic tools. So you could say, my group isn't working very well because we don't really know our purpose. Or we have a good shared purpose, but we don't actually have agreements about what the behaviors are that help us reach that purpose. Or maybe we have agreements about what the behaviors are, but we don't actually keep track of each other's behavior and help each other succeed. So what you can see is that these design principles can be diagnostic. You can use them to assess why your cooperation is not working in a sort of checklist manner. And prosocial has a lot of tools for doing that. But for now, I want to move on from the core design principles and talk about contextual behavioral science, which is basically another key piece of how prosocial works. First, I want to say that just as humans have evolved biologically in terms of our genetics, there's this powerful insight that human behavior follows exactly the same patterns. And I love this quote from B.F. Skinner, who is one of the pioneers and founders of behaviorism and behavioral science, when he said this: "We have seen that in certain respects, the operant reinforcement, which is basically if I have a behavior and there's a consequence, the consequence reinforces whether the behavior is going to happen again or not happen again. That we have seen that certain respects, this operant reinforcement resembles the natural selection of evolutionary theory. Just as genetic characteristics which arise as mutations are selected or discarded by their consequences, so too do novel forms of behavior that are selected or discarded through reinforcement." And I wanted to give this example about cigarette companies marketing smoking to children, that it was learned by public relations and marketing firms that if they created a cartoon-like mascot directed toward teenagers, that this would give teenagers a positive social reinforcement that I will look cool if I smoke. And if I look cool, I will gain more social acceptance. If I gain more social acceptance, I will have more belonging. If attractive people are in the same advertisements, I will have people who I find attractive may accept me and find me attractive. So there were a variety of behavioral reinforcements built into this unethical marketing, which of course had the effect of getting a lot of young people to start smoking. Now there are chemical consequences as well as social consequences to the addictive aspects of nicotine. So once people began smoking, there was a reinforcement of the addictive behaviors, causing people to become lifelong smokers, which had 2 major system-level feedbacks. One is it made the young people lifetime smokers, causing them to have lifetime accumulation of health-related risks, like getting emphysema and cancer. But also, it had the effect of allowing the tobacco companies to sell cigarettes and make more money so that they could spend even more on clever advertising to repeat the cycle. And what you can see is that there is a natural selection, a reinforcement by consequences of behaviors based on the reinforcements associated with those behaviors. This is an insight that B.F. Skinner had back in the 1940s and 1950s, and it became a foundation for many people in marketing and advertising. But this way of understanding the evolution of human behavior as an evolutionary process gives us the context for understanding how we change the behavioral reinforcements, socially and emotionally, to get the reinforcement environments that align with the evolution that we want. So we can guide cultural evolution with this knowledge. It doesn't have to be done unethically like Joe Camel to get young people to smoke. We can use the same underlying insights to create groups that function well, that move us toward prosocial, cooperative, regenerative, life-healing behaviors, and create a better world as a consequence. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some key ideas in contextual behavioral science. The first thing I want to share is that there's a huge body of research in the behavioral sciences and in public health research that shows us two really important things. The first thing is any kind of life outcome that is considered to be a better life, like having a good marriage, graduating high school without dropping out, or forming good and healthy relationships, being a good parent, continuing to stay in school and getting a better education. Whatever the behavior is that people would have associated with quality life outcomes, that their two foundational psychological capacities are the ability to regulate their emotions. So I'm angry, but how do I direct my anger without undermining my future with my present actions? And psychological flexibility, which is the ability to imagine different behaviors and different futures so that that regulation of emotion can be more strategically directed. So this is a really foundational piece of all healthy life decisions. At the same time, in contextual behavioral science, they found that there were these relational frames, which are internal concepts about how people relate one part of their identity to another. They specifically found that the most important relational frame is how people relate their present self to their future self. That if it's Friday night and I'm in college and I have a big exam on Monday, my present self is on Friday, my future self is on Monday morning. And as I think about what should I do this weekend, do I imagine going out drinking with my friends, partying and having fun, and then my future self is unprepared for that exam on Monday morning? Or do I think about that future self and then back engineer? I really want to do well in that exam because it's in a class that's really important to me, because I really want to learn the material, and also that class is important for my larger life goals. Then I can regulate my present emotions and say, even though my friends invited me to go out drinking, I think I should stay home and study. So this combination of regulating emotions and the psychological flexibility to consider different options and relating the present self to future self is a huge, powerful space for changing our own behavior. And this is a foundation of contextual behavioral science. This connects to something that is called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is based on this understanding. And they've created this 4-quadrant matrix that we're now going to learn how to use, which basically has at its core, as you can see the box that says noticing, its core is creating an emotional space of meditative mindfulness and awareness about which emotions we're having, how we feel about those emotions, and the flexibility to consider them so that we can navigate those feelings to get to our goals. This matrix has a left side, which is the things that we do not want, that we'd like to avoid or have less of. And to the right side, the things that we are drawn to, that we want, that we'd like more of in our lives. Now the bottom half, what they call inner experience, is the values, feelings, sentiments, and emotions that we feel in our internal world as we reflect on and have our bodies imagine and simulate different things that we might do. The top half is the observed behaviors and experiences that we could see ourselves doing, or see someone else doing, that we can then use this 4-quadrant map to fill in answers about each of the 4 quadrants. What are the values that I have that I'd like to, what are the values of someone that I'd like to be less like? Or what are feelings that I'd like to have less of? That would be in the bottom left. What are feelings and values that I'd like to have more of? That would be in the bottom right. What are behaviors I've seen other people doing or seeing myself doing? that I would like to do less? That is in the upper left. What are the behaviors that I see others doing or that I do sometimes that I would like to do more often? That goes in the upper right. And what's powerful about this framework is that it allows us to build up our ability to regulate emotions, to be flexible in our psychological responses to those emotions, and to relate our present self to our future self with a scaffolding of what is filled into this matrix. This acceptance and commitment therapy is now being practiced by 15,000 or more therapists. It's commonly used in organizational management, and it has a huge track record of success. So this tool is extremely useful. And we're going to see how it's used in prosocial in just a moment. So basically, let's go through an example. Let's say that we have the 4-quadrant matrix, which is schematically demonstrated here on the left, and we ask these questions. Who is someone that you would like to be? Who is someone that you want to be like? A role model in your life, a person that you are inspired by. Well, filling out the quadrant number 2, you might say, what do you see them doing? For example, you see them engaging in helpful behavior. You see them being patient and non-judgmental. You see them thinking before they act. You see them being generous and not being selfish. So you can start to fill this in. What are the behaviors of this person? Well, they tell the truth a lot. They make sacrifices for themselves for the good of others. They demonstrate devotion to their loved ones. So whatever those things are, you write them down in quadrant 2. In quadrant 4, you might say, which values and feelings are expressed by this person? And you might say, well, they have compassion. They're generous. They have honesty. They're good at sharing. They're patient. They have humility. So those are values and feelings that are related to the behaviors you see, but there might be things that a person feels as their values or as their emotions as they are going through the world, and you put that in quadrant 4. Now, you say, who is someone that you don't want to be like? Maybe you had an abusive uncle. Maybe you watched a movie and there was a villain, a character that you really don't like. However that person is, whether they're a stereotyped character or a real life person, you might say, what are the things you see them doing that you don't like? You put them in the left. Well, maybe they hit people. Maybe they interrupt and talk out of turn and don't let other people speak. Maybe they take more than their share and keep things for themselves. So you write down the behaviors that you see in quadrant 1. And then you go down to quadrant 3 and say, what are the values and feelings being expressed? Violence, selfishness, greed, or other things that you might put into that box. Now what's powerful is once you've filled these things in for the 4 quadrants, now you can look at this on the piece of paper or wherever you wrote it down, and you can ask yourself, just notice, how often do I engage in those behaviors that I don't like? Do I interrupt people sometimes? Do I sometimes take more than my share? How do I feel when I do that? What values are being expressed? That's when you drop down to quadrant 3, when I'm doing those things. Are those the values I really want to have? Wouldn't I rather do more of the things like the person in quadrant 2? How does it feel when I see them doing that? Or when I imagine them doing that? How do I feel when I do that? And you see that you use this to build a capacity, a mindfulness capacity, to be aware, to regulate your emotions, and to have the flexibility of considering these imagined scenarios, to give you an internal sense-making tool. Your body, as you reflect on and notice these behaviors and these feelings and values, this becomes the way that you notice when you're having a behavior that you don't like, or you notice when you're doing a behavior that you do like, or you notice when someone else is doing a behavior that you don't like, or a behavior that you do like. You're creating an internal monitoring system for behaviors that you agree to, where yourself is the commons, so that you can direct yourself toward the future person that you want to be like. So you see how this way of using the framework is really powerful? And this example of doing it for yourself is how you ground yourself in who you are as a person and what kind of purposeful being you would like to be. And this is a very powerful tool for changing your own behavior. Now, what's interesting is when we connect it to the prosocial framework, we can do this at 2 levels. I might fill out those 4 quadrants for myself, like I just gave the example of How do I want to be as a person? But if the group is forming around a shared purpose and a shared identity, you can actually answer the same questions for the group. And you can say, what are the behaviors that I've seen in other groups that I don't want to see in this group? I put that in the upper left. What are behaviors that I've seen in other groups that I do want to see in this group? I put that in the upper right. What are the values that I think are really important to this group that I want us to embody, and how do I want us to feel as members of this group that directs us toward our shared purpose? I put that in the bottom right. And what are the feelings that I've seen and the values I've seen prioritized in other groups that I don't want to be in this one? I put them in the bottom left. And what's powerful is if every member of the group has already done their own matrix for themselves, then they can notice, how do I feel as a person in being a purposeful person, as I relate to the behaviors that are needed to be part of a purposeful group? And now I can show up authentically as the kind of person I want to be, helping the group that I'm now a part of become the kind of group that I want it to be. And this is really important, because what this means is we psychologically improve our individual capacities to cooperate while improving the group's capacity to cooperate at the same time. And this creates an evolutionary process where over time, if we continue using these tools, the individual members of the group become more functioning cooperators, and the group itself becomes more functioning as a cooperative group. And it's this virtuous cycle. And the ACT matrix, the acceptance and commitment therapy matrix from contextual behavioral science, is what enables this to happen. So here's what's amazing, is if you use this group matrix in just the way I described, for the individuals in the group and the group, or maybe subgroups of the group and the group, or one group relating to another group, what it does is it allows you to address all of Elinor Ostrom's design principles. You might come back and say, let's create a group matrix for how we make decisions. Let's create a group matrix about our group's purpose. Let's create a group matrix about how we manage conflicts. And as you go step by step using this matrix for all 8 of the design principles, you improve the individual functioning of the people in the group, creating clarity and structures and support for the whole group, while embodying and practicing the core design principles. And this is the power of prosocial, is it does both of these things in an integrated manner, which is incredibly rich. All right, now I want to move on and say that is a summary of prosocial. And prosocial, let me just summarize here, that we've talked about the 8 core design principles, and we've talked about this acceptance and commitment therapy matrix, so that we can improve the functioning of individuals and improve groups. Now I want to do is talk about what happens as we improve individual people in the groups. And this is where the book, The Nordic Secret, comes into being. Now, The Nordic Secret asks the question, how did the first social democracies arise, specifically in the Scandinavian countries? So in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and the Netherlands, this region of Western Europe, how did they go from being the poorest, least educated people in Europe in the 1850s to a shining example of social democracies by the mid-1900s, 100 years later? The Nordic Secret answers that question. And what they found was that you can explain it using human development frameworks, like this framework that's pictured, which comes from the work of Robert Keegan. And Robert Keegan has found that there are different developmental stages in psychology that map onto human capabilities. Now, a caveat is any model of human development is going to be limited and partly wrong. There are a lot of them out there. And what we find is that they're powerful to think with as long as we don't hold them too tightly. So there are critiques of Robert Keegan's model, but when it's applied to the Nordic Secret and its history, it actually explains quite a lot. And what Lene Anderson and Thomas Bjorkman argued in their book is that the success of these social democracies, the Nordic Secret, was actually a German philosophy of how to develop whole people, the character development of a person across their lifetime, which in German is called Bildung, which is the same word in English for building. And so what they found was that This framework of human development, of developing the character and capabilities of whole people, was actually what was embodied in the folk high schools of the Scandinavian countries, enabling them to build the individual capacities of their citizens to govern themselves. The inspiration for this was that the people in the Scandinavian countries learned about the French Revolution when there was a big attempt at self-governance, and the people of France at that time were not capable of self-governing. They had not developed the human beings enough to cooperate to create a democracy. The Scandinavian countries did just what I showed before. They used frameworks of human development to cultivate capacities for regulating emotions, psychological flexibility, and cooperation, to move people through different levels of psychology, and especially moving to what's called the fourth order level in the Keegan model, which is the level of self-authoring, where a person no longer accepts the story of their culture as given and instead decides to create a life for themselves. And they found, for example, in Denmark in the late 1800s, there were children of farmers who went to the folk high schools, and eventually they would say things like, well, my parents were a farmer, so I'm supposed to be a farmer. That's the story of my society. But I actually am so inspired by this high school, I want to become a teacher. So they author their own life and become a teacher. This capacity to author your own life is Robert Keegan's fourth order level, the level of self-authorship. Now, what's interesting about this is that in any society, you're going to have some subset of the population that is not self-authoring, some set of the population that is, and some subset that has even gone further to what he calls self-transforming, which is when they actively deconstruct their identity and say, who I thought I was is broken. I have to become something better, but I don't have a role model, so I have to create it. This is where the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the true scientists, the true philosophers, all of these people are self-transforming. And so to get to that level requires this philosophy of building, of developing human beings across their lifespan. Now, what's interesting is if you take this idea and look at it at the level of an entire society, then you can do something like this. Let's imagine there's an earlier time where this is completely fictitious, but it's meant to show you how it works. Let's imagine that at a given time, about 50% of the people living in the society are just living out the stories around them. Among all of the people, about 30% have achieved the psychological development ability to create their own stories. So they are choosing their own paths, but they're mostly still accepting stories that are available. They're just picking the one that's most appropriate to them. And so about 30% of the population. But there are 20% of the population who have achieved transformational capacity. They can not only choose which story, but they can choose to break the story and innovate a new model of life. They're the ones that are creating new ways of living. Well, if we employed prosocial and we employed developmental models like Robert Keegan's, we could gradually guide the society toward this future state where 25% of the population is living in the old story, 50% is able to author their own story, and more, going from 20 to 25, has this transformational capacity. If this is the goal of the society, then you can see how this is a way of regenerating the society's capacity to reinvent itself, which is exactly what we need to do as we try to regenerate the earth, is we need to move more and more people from living the stories that are familiar to living new stories, and to creating new ways of living that more people can choose. And as more people move from one to the next of those two levels, the more our cultures become regenerative. So what this shows us is that when we combine the design principles for managing the commons with the insights from contextual behavioral science about how to improve individual and group functioning, that we can actively evolve our societies toward greater cooperation, especially like now in times of severe disruption and change. So imagine if we can guide cultural evolution toward the goals we set together, that we can use these fully demonstrated tools and frameworks like the ones I'm talking about today to do it. So here's how it works. We form teams. The teams actually work. Those teams work together with other teams to coordinate their actions around bioregional scale. Let's regenerate this watershed. Let's bring soil back to this place. Let's bring the native forest back to this place. Let's build economic models that no one has ever done before and develop people with our education systems. Develop people to the capacity to choose different stories and create new stories. And as this happens bioregionally, our bioregions can coordinate with each other to move toward planetary goals of Earth regeneration. This is possible. And as we've seen in the webinar today, the tools are available. We can do this. So with that in mind, let's remember, the key to all of this is teamwork. And the key to teamwork is knowing how to cultivate healthy human development. If the people who are going to work in the team are developing to become more cooperative people and more imaginative, innovative, creative people, then they will work in more highly functioning teams. And that is the key to regenerating the Earth. So in conclusion, we want to restore planetary health. This is how we safeguard humanity's future. To do this, we have to cooperate across many scales while dealing with incredible complexity. Luckily, there are powerful tools to create functioning groups and grow these capacities. And that's what our study group is going to be doing and has been doing. And that's what we're talking about today in the webinar. So, as we keep building this Design Institute for Regenerating the Earth, let's explore how to do this. So I'm looking forward to seeing your questions and having this discussion with you and to creating together. So here I am back with you, and I see we have a bunch of questions. It looks like I used a little more time in the presentation portion than I normally do. I hope that's okay. I just wanted to share with you in depth how all of this works, because we can go further into this in the study group. And please, please go to prosocial.world, to the website. Sign up for their trainings, get certified. I know several of the people who have helped create that framework. It's incredible. We should be using it. So with that in mind, I would like to now start a discussion about the questions that people have been asking. So if you have a question, bring it over to the Ask a Question box and post it there. Vote for the questions you would most like to have answered, and I will answer them or invite discussion around them from the most votes to the least votes. And like before, if you're the person who asked the question, what I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to invite the person who asked the question into a shared screen so that we can have a discussion. But what I say is the first question that's actually most asked is a question that doesn't really need to be a shared screen. And so Dan Noble has asked, how do we make your slides bigger so we can see the wording in the format that I've given? And Dan, instead of inviting you into a shared discussion about this one, I'll just say that it's my intention to make these slides available, and I'll be posting them to the study group so we can get to them there. And also, as you watch the video of this later, you can stop and zoom in on pieces of it. So there will be ways to see that information. But I just wanted to name that one first because it's sort of a housekeeping issue that we'll find ways to get those slides to everyone so that you can follow them better. So thank you for asking that question. Now the next question is actually asked by Amy Meyer. Amy is an old friend of mine that I know from my Rockridge Institute days. And Amy, what I'm going to do is invite you into the discussion by inviting you into a shared video. If you do not want to share the video, please post in the chat box that you don't want to. In the meantime, I hope you can come in so we can discuss this. And what you're asking here is, in working with current groups, people from different backgrounds, I frequently find that just one or a few type A personalities who say they want to collaborate actually just lean on old systems of privilege and dominance. This is often rooted in patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacism. And the power dynamic is totally off. What do I do? Sometimes I exclude myself so much I feel like I'm just not participating. So, Amy, I'm going to invite you into the screen, and I hope you're able to join me. It'd be really nice to have this conversation together. And what I want to stress initially is this is probably something that a lot of us have experienced. And so let's just recognize right off the bat that when there's a person in your group who is being antisocial in the group, that this is exactly where we need the acceptance and commitment therapy tools. Exactly. So hi, Amy, how are you doing? It's great to see you. Something weird with your video, but can you hear me? Your screen is split for some reason, which is a bit strange. Try to say something and let's at least see if the audio works. Oh, you're locked out. Okay, well then let's just, oh, there you are. Very weird visual.
Now I can't hear you.
Can you hear me at all? Testing, testing. Can everyone hear me? Well, Amy, if you can't hear me,
Okay.
if you can hear me, give like a quick +1 in the chat box. And if you can't hear me, let me know. So Amy can't hear me. Can other people hear me right now? Because other people can hear me. So Amy's gonna drop out and come back. Let me just start while Amy tries to reconnect, because this is so important. Is that one thing that's going to happen is that the good faith, the good intention, the trust and feelings, the connection between people is a commons. And that's a really important part of how we understand these dynamics. So when you have a person in the group who's actually antisocial, what you really, okay, Amy, since it's not working, we'll just try and continue, and if you're able to rejoin me, I'd much rather have you talk, but technical problems happen sometimes. Let me just say that one of the things you can do is, as the group uses the ACT matrix to identify what are the behaviors we want more of and the behaviors you want less of, this is exactly where you can create the framework for managing the behavior of that person. So if you have someone who is being antisocial, they lean back on dominance hierarchies, they come from a privileged place, they talk over other people. By mapping out the behaviors you want less of, the behaviors you want more of, doing this as individuals and as a group, you actually make all of that visible. And then you can have group processes of discussing them. And I think this is actually where the magic happens. So that's actually the key to this, is to make visible the behaviors to monitor and creating agreements about how to monitor them, so that you have the decision-making and conflict resolution tools. Also, if someone is not being a prosocial participant, how can you helpfully guide them toward the behaviors that are more helpful? And if they filled out their own 4-quadrant matrix, you can actually say to them things like, I noticed you were doing this thing that even you say you don't like, and I'd like to help you do more of the thing you do like. You can't have that conversation unless it's somehow become made visible to the group. So you have to carefully think about whether there's enough trust to do that initially, or whether you build the trust to have an exercise like that later. But it's that facilitation process that is going to help cultivate these capacities. So that's a bit of an answer to your question. And I think we're going to continue answering it as we keep going. And definitely what Laura said about using the ACT framework will help reveal power and privilege, and also reveal how people feel about it, which is super important. Sometimes people do these things habitually. They don't know they're doing it. And you can actually give them the internal tools to monitor their own behavior. Sometimes people do things that are privileged and talking out of turn and selfish and all this stuff without knowing they're doing it. And so part of this is helping create those internal emotional feedbacks to enable those behaviors to become more expressed. So I think that's a really important piece of this. Now, the next question that's been voted up, which is by Brian McConnell. Hey, Brian, how are you? I'm going to invite you into the call. He's saying, over a prolonged period of 10 years or more. So Brian, if you're there, I'm inviting you into the screen. It says, over a prolonged period of 10 years or more, I'm reaching the conclusion that my city's governing body doesn't either recognize nor subsequently bear responsibility for common pooled resources. Wonder if you have suggestions about how I might effectively broach this issue. Well, one thing that's really important is, like I mentioned about the ability to self-govern, if you have a municipal government that has departments within it, like a transportation department, for example, that's different from, say, a food security department, that you've already created management structures that undermine Eleanor Ostrom's principles. So one thing that you can do is you can start to focus on where do these structures of decision making need to map on to the systems that we need to manage. And this might be done, for example, with task forces. It looks like Brian's not able to join for some reason. So Brian, let me know in the chat box if you're having technical problems. But this is one way to begin to navigate this issue, is to recognize how to think about these structural mismatches, and then to figure out, like, do we need to create a task force that combines these different groups so that they have the jurisdiction and we form a new group? Or is it that there are existing task forces or other groups that do have the jurisdiction, but that need to cultivate their cooperation abilities better? And so you have different avenues depending on what specifically this situation is. But I think that this is something really important, is to understand that the diagnostics, like saying that design principle number 7 about ability to self-govern, may be why your municipal government can't manage common pooled resources. So how do you create a framework around what needs to be managed so that it can govern itself using whatever existing governing tools are there, or bypassing them, depending on the situation? So there's a lot of detailed work in organizational management, community organizing, and other things that are related to that. But that's kind of a general way of understanding what we might think about for that question. So I see here that Anna has asked a question that's gotten a lot of votes. And Brian, I hope that answers it well enough for you. So Anna, I'm gonna invite you in, and hopefully the technology will allow you to participate. I've just invited you onto the screen. It says, what place, if any, do you envision money having in a regenerative and sustainable future? How do you think would be more appropriate for such a future between resource-based economy and money-based economy? All right, so this question, Anna, I hope you're able to join me, because I can tell that you probably have a lot to say about this. You probably know I do. Yay, the technology worked. You're here. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, let's talk about this. This mismatch between money and what we might just call resource flows, generally, because it has so many applications. Like, what are you thinking about here? And like, let's kind of start with what motivated you to ask the question, and then let's talk a little about it, and then see how we can navigate some learning with it.
Okay, so I am aware that in order to have, okay, gosh, where to start? Okay, I think economy is the foundation of culture, right? So where an economy being like the management of resources, resource distribution, agriculture, that kind of thing. So where economy is the foundation of culture, if we have something like, if our resources are managed with the primary incentive being, being to funnel access from like the lower classes to the upper classes, ultimately that is going to impede efficiency on a really serious way. Whereas if we have our economy being resource-based, so thinking like what needs to go where, what are the optimum things to use here, I mean, it seems so straightforward. It's kind of amazing that we're in the pickle that we're in. But if we have a resource-based economy, then things flow more efficiently. So I was interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Yeah, one thing to start is that part of the power of financial systems is that they signal value. And so for good and bad, right? But they signal value, and it's not that difficult to create a framework of interpretation. If I have this property worth 50,000 units of my currency, and if I sold it and bought this other piece of property and did something on it, it might be worth 80,000 units of my currency. Then I have a way of measuring value. in a way of increasing or decreasing value of transactions. So the use of money is really powerful for this. It also signals status and importance and other more normative things, which similarly are very powerful. So if we just ask the question, because this is like a little slice of a huge conversation, we just ask the question, what are the resources that need to be managed as a commons? Because if we don't manage them as a commons, our future is death. Basically, we will die if we don't have food supply. We will die if we don't have water. And these basic resources we need to manage well. And if we asked, how does the signaling of value in a monetary system keep us from managing those things well? Which is like a place where managing the commons is broken down. So you might take Eleanor Ostrom's principles and do an analysis there. Or the other way is to say, well, let's just ignore that monetary system for a moment, go back to first principles, Eleanor Ostrom's principles, and say, these are the resources we need to manage. What would a monetary system look like that would manage them well? And how does that relate to our existing monetary system? And one thing I think we'll quickly find is that there are some really serious structural problems in the way that we create money and signal value. That'll become obvious really quickly. I can cut down a forest and destroy it because we didn't value the ecosystem functions of the forest. They weren't in our accounting books. So the value that's being signaled by money is invisible.
And everything else is just an externality at that point. When you're looking at the accounting books, everything else, which is, so real and so filled with horror and dire circumstance, is just in the margin marked externality. It's such a distorted perspective.
Yeah, another thing is that when we understand how to manage a commons, we're like, oh, you need to have a group, and the group functions in these ways, and it needs to have these features of how it makes decisions. And you can look and see that one of the big problems with neoliberal financialized capital, which is a specific incarnation of capitalism, a specific incarnation of financial markets, is that it creates a system where money becomes decision-making authority. If I have more money, I can decide what happens to more land because I can just buy the land. And then I can manipulate and influence the structures of markets to change prices. Like I could build up a supply chain and own it through a collaboration, this is what monopolies are, and then distort the prices for my own gain. And this is what neoliberal financialized capitalism does, or part of what it does. And so if we're like, well, what should we create instead? It would be, well, how would we, instead of distort, how do we authentically signal? What's actually valuable is what we need to see as value. And if anyone is improving the value of it, how do they get their contributions recognized? And then we're starting to do regenerative design, right? We're designing a regenerative economy now. So yeah, I'd love to just hear what you think about that. And, like, are there projects you're working on now related to this, or is this just something you're exploring more conceptually? I'm really curious.
I'm actually working on a project called the Global Redesign Institute. The idea behind that is basically it's a simulation game, and participants are invited to redesign, the resource manufacturing, distribution, agricultural systems with a view to then seeing how that plays on culture and on emerging culture. I don't know if you ever played any computer games like Tropico, or more recently there was that really cool Jurassic Park game where as you're building these civilizations from scratch and you're laying the groundwork, you get pop-ups like similar to Clippy, if you ever used Word document.
Yeah, I haven't played recent games, but I played games like The Sims and SimCity and Sim Earth back in the 90s, which have some similarities at least, so I can relate.
Yeah,
super powerful.
Sorry?
They're very powerful.
Yeah.
They're really powerful.
Well, that actually reminds me of what you said sort of close to the beginning of this webinar about collective intelligence can happen when our patterns of behavior are aligned with collective intelligence. And that is really what I'm hoping to achieve with this game, because you would have prompts. So like when you start to design a Center for Disease Control or just a simple waste managing system, you'd have a prompt saying, well, these are the resources which are locally available. These are the energy sources which are sustainable and regenerative given your location. These are the avenues which are preferable. And you could just be like, all right, I'm going to, follow the prompts. Or you could just be like, I've got my own vision, to heck with that, and create your own thing. The idea is then that all saved work is sent back to the servers via blockchain or something similar. And then the most efficient designs, and again, that will be something that speaks to itself. It's not going to be me sitting back and, oh, which design do I like more? It's going to be the most efficient designs, the ones that work the best.
You can actually do a lot with co-creation of decision-making tools and other things like in the game. Yeah, totally.
And then the most efficient designs are custom coded into a continuously updated map of the region. And as we expand the game as my multidisciplinary team, which I don't have yet, but would really like to have, creates this game for more and more regions. What would happen then is you have a democratically created blueprint for the redesign of Earth's economy. And what I'm most passionate about with this is that it kind of strikes that balance between efficiency and liberty, which has, historically been very hard to strike. And that struggle has been the source of a lot of strife.
Yeah, well, one thing I just say is anytime you can get your biophysical flows, the actual materials of things that are moving, to be tracked by the monetary system, then the economy is going to work better. And so that's basically like if we're currently valuing our global economy based on dead sunlight from 200 million years ago by using fossil fuels. And if we simply understood that, we would realize we have a giant, what's basically a speculative bubble of dead sunlight that we're very quickly depleting. But our monetary system is not recognizing the biophysical flow, how biology and physics actually work. So getting those two together is going to be really important for designing and for scenario like role play. So super important. And just realizing we should probably jump to other questions just because there's so many of them, but really stimulating. And I hope we can explore this further in the study group and just as we keep talking. So thanks for this. It's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, this is so important for us to get to a place where we can really co-create these imagined futures to have more psychological flexibility, as we were talking about before. See the next question coming in that is from Dave Pendle, which is, so Dave is asking, Dave, I'm going to go to invite you into the screen, which is, the design principles may require an enormous amount of investment time. Often groups function through activities rather than designing the context. Have you encouraged groups you've worked with to take these tasks on board? Now, Dave, come on in. I hope you're able to get here, because one thing I would say, first of all, is if we don't take the time to get our groups to function, we're never going to get where we're going, and a huge amount of time is wasted. And so there's this idea of we slow down to hurry up. We take the time we need to do it right so that we can do it right. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I really hope you're able to come in for the discussion. Oh, hey, Dave, how are you? You came in and dropped out. Are you there? Oh, there you are. Hey, I see you. Can you hear me okay?
Hey, good to see you.
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let me.
I'm on two cameras. So I've got to just stop one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love your question. Yeah. Let's talk about it. Let's share a little more of what you're thinking here about, like what motivated the question. What's on your mind? Let's talk about this. Oh, and now he's got to reconnect. Well, while we're dealing with the joys of technology, one thing I've seen is that the motivation may be existing problems. Like there might be a group that has a recognized, like people are already talking about something that's not working, which creates an opportunity for a pathway to bring the discussion in about the aspect of the group. So, yes, Roberta, I just saw what you said in the chat box. The virus is making us slow down so that we can hurry up, which is what I hope we can do with these webinars. One way to encourage a group to take these tasks on board is for people who are in the group to start to make themselves aware of their group function. Is your group working or is it not? How is the group handling whether the group is working or not? Instead of coming in and saying, I've got this great tool, but you don't know you have a problem. One way to do this is to come in and just listen, the permaculture approach. Watch and listen in the group and say, I kind of noticed you guys have this problem. Do you guys feel like you have this problem? This thing that seems to be happening? How are you handling that right now? What is it that you're doing? And then from that inquiry, you can start to say, well, I actually know some really useful tools that you might try to help with that. And so this way of kind of permaculture-wise, listening and co-creating is a really useful facilitation approach. But sorry, Dave, I started answering while we were trying to get the tech to work.
Yeah, no, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, I heard most of your response. I think what's interesting is just sort of like we're in a global pause at the moment, but taking pause to monitor the health of the group. I tried to set up a group where moving to a sustainable carbon zero sort of self-generated city in the Netherlands, in a new town called Almere. And we did some initial bringing people together, but then a crisis took over and people left the group. And then the process of building the houses took over. So the design principles you're referring to, I mean, some people did behave badly and violate group norms, but there was no agreements in the first place because we simply didn't have time. So that's the reason I put the question forward.
Yeah, I think one of the, I always say it's like a strategic intervention, is the more we cultivate the human capacities for emotion regulation and psychological flexibility, the more those improvisations will function.
Yeah.
Which could just be doing an improv theater training, and it could be a team building exercise for fun, that is really addressing a strategic need, but is a backdoor in. But regardless of how it's done, I think this recognition that in the time of chaos and confusion is exactly when people need more of this ability.
No, exactly, yeah.
Right? And so that becomes a high priority intervention. Whatever you're going to try to do for the group's function, that is going to enable the group to function better as a group. And so I think that sort of awareness about where we are in time, like this is the immediate, like bandwidth limiting thing for us, is going to be one way of bringing these things into the group, which good facilitators know how to do this, right?
I think it really applies to be able to think in motion when there's a lot of pressure. This idea of mental flexibility you were bringing in earlier, like when you're in the midst of things, to be able to kind of monitor how it is, how the group is, how I am, and how everyone else is. That's quite a sophisticated skill.
Yeah, it's something that people cultivate across their lifetimes.
Yeah.
And so we need to be thinking multi-year, multi-decade, and multi-generation about. But also we could think days, hours, weeks, and months. And it's fractal. But anything we do now or in the next week will help what happens in the next year, so to speak.
I get it.
But you're absolutely right. This is building social complexity and capacity, managing social complexity both at the same time.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's huge.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Good to hear that.
Thanks for the question. It's super helpful. Yeah. Awesome. Moving on to Hello, hello, testing. Can everyone hear me now? Thumbs up, plus ones in the chat box if you can hear me now. Usually a refresh is all that's needed, but I just like to be sure it works. Okay, so wonderful. We know about this problem and have found our way through it. So Rachel Butler has asked a great question, which I'd like to start answering and invite Rachel in to talk about, if Rachel is still here. Just how can we identify our bioregion? And this is a question in some ways about what is the first criteria of Eleanor Ostrom, the shared identity and shared purpose, and what we can say about bioregions. And I've answered this in other settings before, so I want to start off more brief and then allow the richness to come in if Rachel's able to join me, because I like to be able to, it says Rachel's trying to get in. Okay, we'll try it one more time and see if it works. One thing to say is that bioregions are defined geophysically, like drainage basins for watersheds, or tectonic plates for creating mountain ranges, or coastal estuaries for a marine ecosystem. So part of the way that they are measured is the functions of the landscape itself. But there's also this cultural layer of shared identity, which is super interesting. And hi, Rachel, how are you?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Doing good, doing good. What I would like to do is turn this question around and maybe ask you, how do you understand your bioregion? Like, tell me where you are and how you understand the landscape and how it's organized. And then from that, we can kind of, navigate to how we would understand it as a bioregion. And then we can see that.
Okay, I'll give it a go. I'm not quite as academic as you are. I'm much more of a generalist.
All the better. I'm too academic.
So our project is in Bristol in the southwest of England. The city of Bristol is bringing forward 11 pieces of land in the city for community-led housing groups. So we're going to be building our own communities in the city. And yeah, so all of the work you're doing relates really strongly to what we're aiming to achieve. And we talk about bioregions a lot. And my brain has been wandering off trying to work out what our bioregion is. My dad's a retired geography teacher. He would be rolling his eyes at me right now. But so I'm trying to sort of work out what the scale of our bioregion is, and therefore part of what I see my role is, okay, so now I need to go and talk to landowners, because now we've sort of catalyzed the city into doing what they need to do to enable us to build our communities. So how can we then move out into talking with landowners who can grow the resources regeneratively that we need to build our houses? So I'm trying to work out how far around Bristol we need to go.
Yeah, okay, so one part of bioregions that makes them inherently controversial. And what I mean is, you could have 10 different bioregional thinkers and they come up with 3 different meanings of your bioregion, and you never get them to agree.
Okay.
There's actually a long history of this. And I think it's important to be comfortable with that messiness, because we still need to move forward. If we try to get them to all agree, we'll eventually get to a place where we're just being dumb and we're not doing anything. And so it's important. One thing to say is that bioregions don't have a single scale because they're actually nested systems.
Right.
So you have different systems with different scales and they interact. And so you can have disagreement about which one is the bioregion. Right. But a classic definition is a watershed. So a watershed is basically, if the water hits the ground, wherever I am, what is the contour of all the land for all of the other water that hits the ground? The gravity would pull to the same place.
Right.
It drains all into the same river and ends up in the same, land-bound lake or sea, or it goes to the ocean or whatever it is. And so the watershed, this way of looking at the gravitational pull of water, is a common way of defining a bioregion.
So
there's
if we
another.
start mapping the waterways around Bristol, and one of our bits of land, the River Frome runs right alongside it. So yeah, I guess we could start by mapping all the waterways around the city, and then start. That'd be a good place to start, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Peter Berg, who created the World Drum Foundation and just did lots of great work on bioregions, he would have a group when he started bioregional education. He'd give them a big piece of paper, have them draw a little dot in the middle and say, this is where you live. Yeah. Okay, on this map, can you draw for me where your water comes from?
Right.
And we'd be amazed, like people would be flabbergasted, like, I should know the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, you say, oh, your homework, go find out where your water comes from.
Right, that's my homework then, Joe.
Well, that's really helpful. But what you're going to find is you're also going to find an interesting cultural history lens, which is before globalization, before the big cities and their trade networks in the last 50 years or 100 years, what did these subsistence cultures look like that lived here?
Right.
So 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, the people that lived here, what was their network of trade?
Wow, that would be so
fascinating. That network of trade is a self-organizing human system as a bioregion.
Yeah.
And you're going to find it's going to be organized around water, but it might be organized around other things too.
Okay.
So those are two ways to answer that question. And so does that help? Does that kind of get you going?
It really does. It really does help, actually. Yeah, and there's lots of research and investigation to be done, but we've got lots of time, so that's great.
Yeah, and Vivek has just dropped into the chat box Peter Berg's Learning to Partner with Life Place. It's in the chat box.
Great.
That's a one-year bioregional curriculum. Highly recommend that to everyone. Thank you, Vivek, for dropping it in the chat box.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Yeah, and Rachel, lovely to talk with you.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye.
Kisses back from Colombia. All right, let's keep rolling here. So important to be able to answer these questions. So I see that our next question that we have. Well, actually, first, we've been going for an hour and a half. Let me do a quick check with everyone. I want to say, how does everyone feel? I'm just adding a poll so you guys can see that I dropped in a poll. How does everyone feel? Great, keep going, or getting full, let's stop soon. So go ahead and just start filling that in. I want to get a feel from everyone. Because that'll give me a little feedback on how quickly or slowly we should keep rolling. Because I know that I'm like a fire hose sometimes. And so, so looks like we're leaning toward keeping going. So we'll just roll for a little while longer and see how it all rolls. The next question, which is coming from Bjorn. And so Bjorn, I want to invite you into the screen so we can have this conversation. And say, Bjorn is asking a really nice generative question, which is all the points of prosocial must have counterpoints and exceptions. And wants to know more about how do we explore those counterpoints and exceptions. For example, fair and balanced inclusive decision making must be balanced in knowledge and comprehension between members. And I think this is a hugely important question. So Bjorn, I hope you're able to join me for us to start answering it. And while I'm waiting for you to hopefully join, let me say that this is the art of creating functioning teams. So thank you for asking this question. Hi, how are you? And welcome.
Love to hear you, Joe, and nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So tell me more of this question you're asking. Are you thinking of this specifically as like diagnostics? Like I'm currently optimizing one, but how do I know how to think about the effects on the others? Or are you thinking about it differently? Give me more of, when you asked the question, what was coming up for you? So we can dig into it together.
Yeah, sure. The easiest way in would be your reference towards the adult human development system, like Keegan and others, and saying that they're great when held not too tight or when held loosely. And I don't see the same attitude reflected with regards to your promoting the prosocial system, where I just want to address, like, hey, what is the underlying organizing principle under prosocial that would supersede its individual principles in order to deal with the inevitable exceptions that come up with every one of these principles. You have points where, you know, no, that's actually in this case not the thing to do, because in that we're missing this and this specific issue.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. One thing is that there are aspects of this framework that are, I would just say, broadly empirically supported and rigorous, and so they give us insights in general. I'll give two examples just to look at that part. One is, how do self-organizing systems arise? What does complexity science tell us about that? And when we step back and think of Elinor Ostrom's principles as how groups form and what aspects are of that formation process, they need to conform with self-organizing processes in general. So that's one way of seeing that complexity science might approach things differently that Elinor Ostrom didn't specifically look at. So there's a because of that. But we could then lean into complexity science and say, well, here in this study of self-organization, we actually find something that we should combine with or do instead of this part of Elinor Ostrom's framework, because there's such deep power and applicability to self-organization.
Yeah, so that's precisely what I'm referring to. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Danielle Dennett.
Yes.
So one of the major aha-erlebnisse for me there was the discussion of the principle of bent selfishness. That altruism and selfishness both are not ultimately functioning principles. And you see that a little bit reflected in the global dynamic between capitalism and communism. Like, both extremes don't work. So you need, so the way he phrases, you need something like the ability to be selfish for something greater than yourself. And things like self-preservation, growth, the inclusion of dominance hierarchies as opposed to the rejection of them. These were things like, hey, how do you see those fit in? Is there room in the prosocial model to actually work with existing power structures as opposed to just trying to oppose them?
Yeah, the deeper evolutionary, so the area of evolutionary theory that has largely addressed this is, historically, it was a debate between individual selection and group selection, which lasted for 80 or 100 years. Danielle Dennett has been a contributor to that discourse. And the resolution of that, which I think is similar to the resolution of nature versus nurture, is obviously it's both and, but the context matters, which is, whether it's more of nature or more of nurture depends on the context, that this is resolved with what's called multi-level selection. Multi-level selection recognizes, and it's partly drawn from complexity science, it recognizes that there are different levels of organization that are evolving at the same time. And they have different mechanisms of selection, or they're not being selected for or against. They might just be like equivalent to genetic drift, where they're moving randomly or not really moving in a particular direction. But there are interactions across scales. So what matters is the relative contribution of different scales. So for example, you might have individual self-interest becomes more important in an environment where the group is not functioning. But if the group needs to function because the individual can't get their self-interested needs met without collaborating with others, then you need to have mechanisms for higher group function. And you get this shifting back and forth. And so multi-level selection framework, it doesn't resolve all of the issues, but it gets us a lot closer. And what's significant about prosocial is that David Sloan Wilson helped contribute to the creation of multi-level selection, and it's one of the pillars of prosocial. So when I talked about the ACT matrix for the individual and the ACT matrix for the group, I was implicitly using multi-level selection.
Roger.
So you can actually move our pro-social behaviors for the individual up to the group level without contradicting the needs and the freedoms of the individual, because they're co-creating it. And I think this kind of non-ideological and very pragmatic perspective helps us get past a lot of ideological nonsense that's just annoying when we need to solve these problems. But I feel like what you're touching on is deeply, deeply important, because it's so, something on my roof was just blown by the wind. It's so important for those of us trying to strategically design interventions to find our blind spots and to move beyond them. So I think your question is hugely important. And I'm curious, before moving on to the next question, for the sake of time, is there anything else you'd like to share before we do? Like, am I getting in a direction that helps, or do you feel like I'm still not addressing it enough? Or
no, I think you actually addressed my issue precisely when you said it's not about finding some kind of ideology to hang on to, but it's more about, well, you translate it into pragmatism. I would take it a little bit deeper, like finding the true meaning generating framework. Like, what is the thing that pro-social is willing to die for in order to preserve its persistence? So there must always be some kind of exit criterion, like, okay, now we have served our purpose and we actually recognize that a higher principle than the one we have been empowering is now required in order to do it. My only sort of sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you weren't going on. Please continue.
Yeah. So my parting gift is sort of related to a different point I was making. I was really impressed just by your conceptualization of cultural evolution, and it's been something that is a deep passion of mine. And maybe you could recommend, I don't know how you say, response to my central hypothesis, which is that I believe that the best way to serve the creation of a better future is by enabling the intellectually and specifically the technologically gifted people of this world into this level of adult human development that you've been talking about, because they are the ones that are creating the technology that are actually influencing social dynamics, economic change on a global scale. So shoot, fire away.
One thing is, I see a lot of evidence that is already what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people who get to these higher levels of psychological flexibility, emotion regulation, and then the intellectual development accompanying that, are also very good at thinking flexibly with technology. So there's that part. And then the other side to it is what I would just, as a shorthand, I would say there's the permaculture or ecological thinking, systems thinking community that may or may not be technology focused, that is achieving similar capacities. And it's when the two blend, that's when there's real power. Mm-hmm. Like the Regen network that's working with blockchain and agroforestry. Those examples are, I think, leading edge exemplars for us. So yes, we are aligned deeply. So onward we go. Thank you for the.
Together we are the future. Thank you, Joe.
All right, thank you so much, Bjorn. Now, so I see that we're getting to the 15-minute mark, which means we're going to need to start a wrap up in a little bit. But I think, let me just ask the poll again. This is just a litmus test for us, because I really want to be sure that I'm responding to everyone. Are we still good to continue, yes or no? Now that we've gone a little further. And while you're answering that, I will continue to the next question. But it's just a question if we do a wrap up sooner or later, because I think it's just so important for us to be working as a group role modeling and embodying what we're talking about as much as we can. Okay, so I see, interestingly, one of the next questions is asked by Ruben. Let's jump in on this one. Ruben was not able to join with the technology earlier. It's not giving the option to invite you to join. But what do you judge to be the percentage of folks in the USA who are already capable of living into truly transformative stories? Oh, that's a great question. Let me give the body of research that I think answers this question the best. So he's asking for the people who are able to transform the stories in the United States, what percentage is probably in that category versus other breakdowns. I think the most powerful framework for answering that question has been the book in the research called The Cultural Creatives. And The Cultural Creatives, which if someone can grab a link, I know Jeff McNeely knows it well, grab a link to the book for Cultural Creatives. Can someone drop that in the chat box for me? What the Cultural Creatives did was they divided mostly the US, and then later they did an analysis of Western Europe. They divided human societies into 3 levels, which is there are people who are cultural creatives, which would be these people with this transformational capacity. There would be sort of mainstream people who would be sort of the consumers and adopters of innovations coming from those creatives. And there would be these traditional anti-innovation, trying to hold down the old ways, resisting change kind of people. Thank you, Jeff and Vivek, for dropping that into the chat box. And what was found by doing a longitudinal study was that about 40 years ago, they were equally divided, about 33% of each. About a third were cultural creatives, about a third were traditional, which is basically resistant to change, and about a third were mainstream. And it was based on the social values living out in their lives. What they found was by the late 90s, when the Cultural Creatives book was written, was the traditionals had dropped to 25%, forget the exact numbers, maybe Jeff will remember. The mainstreamers had grown to a larger percentage, around 40%, and the cultural creatives had grown to around 40%. And so what you saw was a developmental trend of more of the population becoming cultural creatives, but also more just becoming adopters of innovative technologies, and a declining number of people resisting change. And so if you look at that as a loose framework, a heuristic, you'd say that a lot of the dysfunctions in the US have been the fragmentation of the US political system, inequality in the US economic system, activating the anger, fear, and disgust of those resisting, which is the neoconservative movement, to manipulate people and fragment the majority against each other. And the majority is somewhere between 70 and 80% of the US population. And so I think that there is a similar kind of blind spot that, that looks at this. But the US is breaking down and in the middle of collapse as a system. So I think there's a lot more openness to change than people realize, but it's not going to be visible in the behavior of the system itself. The system is just way too dysfunctional and broken down. So I would caution that saying that a lot of people in the US are ready and capable to participate in transformation does not mean the systems can be transformed, because a lot of the systems are so broken and rapidly collapsing that we need to sort of compost them rather than trying to save them. So that's a whole discussion to itself that we should all have sometime. But Ruben, thanks for the question. I hope that answers it well enough. And moving on, because I want to just keep rolling, and there's so many good questions here, is, see, the next question being asked is, actually my voting up and voting down is not jumping back. I see one that's got 5 votes, which is one that Bjorn had asked. And Bjorn, rather than inviting you back in, I'm just going to go a little quicker this time, if that's okay. But I want to start answering this one. Do you agree that the biggest leverage for cultural impact is, oh, we actually already sort of answered that one, so I'll just call it done, is these technological people with technological capabilities being among the most capable of transforming. We already sort of touched on that. So thanks for asking it in our conversation so we can jump on. What I would like to do is just jump back to these questions and say, right now, I want to answer a couple more of the questions. But what I also want to do is see if any other questions are going to be asked. If someone has a question they would like to ask right now that others vote up, let's see if we can shift the conversation to it by that voting. But otherwise, I'll just continue for a couple more minutes to answer these questions fairly quickly, but also transition in a couple of minutes into our wrap up. So I see we have a question here by Ruben. That is, what is the role in all of this of nature and power of human cultures? All of us are born into and formed deeply and unconsciously by a culture that is already a going concern with language, roles, habits, etc. One cannot escape all of this just by deciding to. So one thing I want to say is there is a book that everyone should read called Overshoot by William Catton Jr., published around 1980, that tells us what is going to happen to the dominant culture regardless of what we do, which is that it is already a culture built on 200 years of Western development progress stories, a story of what he calls the age of exuberance, that technology and ingenuity can solve all of our problems, and that that infinite growth is always available to us through ingenuity. As a human ecologist, he has shown that that is simply not going to be the case. And that system is in overshoot and it's going to collapse. We have some discussion topics in the Earth Regenerator study group about this. But I want to say is no amount of wishful dreaming is going to change the reality of planetary overshoot and the collapse of that system. In a basic thermodynamic way, it cannot continue and it's in the process of self-destructing. So part of the answer to this question about the dominance and power of human cultures is the biggest power, which we discussed in a previous webinar about Wetiko, is the power of us to imagine a dream-like story to be true when it's actually no longer true. If we believe the dominant culture can exist when thermodynamically it cannot, we have just given up our power to create an alternative culture. And so part of our challenge is not so much in how strong those cultures are, but discerning what can and cannot be changed in the different cultures so that we can co-create the cultures that humanity needs right now. And that means we have more power to change culture than we realize. And at the same time, we have less power to change dominant culture than most of us realize. We have to get really good at discerning both of those, and they require emotion regulation and psychological flexibility to do that discernment. And the act of discerning is collective intelligence. So we have to create groups that do that well. So everything we're talking about right now, about prosocial, group function, collaboration, cultivating human capabilities, is also how we do sense making and discernment. And so I just wanted to recognize that that's a hugely important piece of this. So that's my answer to that question for now. Ruben, thank you for asking it. And I feel like we're getting to a point that maybe we should answer one more question and then do a wrap up. So I'll just do that now and hope that's okay. So that Danny has asked a question saying the beginning of the webinar talked about insects, and I thought you were following Kropotkin towards inherent tendencies towards mutual aid. And then you moved over to talk about democracy as some kind of evolutionary progression. I will talk about this, Danny. Let me do this. And because we're so close to being out of time, I hope it's okay that I don't invite you into the call. But what I want to say is I never have in my own mind a linear progression of evolution for human societies. So when I think about there were hunter-gatherer societies, and then there were, later in time, there were agricultural societies. Then later in time, there were empires. That might presume a progression from one to the next, a linear progression. One of the biggest problems in the 20th century with the study of cultural evolution was people believing these linear stage theories of social development, which are largely untrue. So when you mentioned Kropotkin and mutual aid, and then saw me moving to democracy, as though I was saying we progress to democracies because they're better than mutual aid networks. Which I don't think you meant to say that, but you were questioning to be sure I didn't say that. But I want to say that in my mind, I never have an assumption of linear progression. Never, ever, ever. And anytime someone does, they're probably wrong. And I want to say that because as we try to go from one type of social organization to another, it is not a linear progression. Instead, it is a complex system going through a pattern of breakdown, reorganization, and coalescence around new emergent patterns, which are co-evolving all at the same time. And that whether we're going to mutual aid networks, or we're going to democracies, or we're going to market systems, or whatever they are, going from one mode of organization to another, it's always this complex system dynamic. And I say that because we should have a discussion somewhere in the study group around these different philosophies and how they relate to cultural evolution. But anytime there's a presumption of linear progression from one to another, it's going to be wrong, which is a beautiful place to have a discussion. And I think that you are right to question that, and we should all be wary of our ideologies, as Bjorn and I were briefly discussing, as we figure out our design pathways. So I hope that answers the question well enough. And what I want to say now is it's probably a good time for a wrap up. And I want to say that if you haven't joined our study group, the button is here, join our study group now. It's free. All of these webinars and the study group are given in the spirit of Danny, let's have a conversation about it. Maybe bring it up in the study group or some other place, and let's start a structured conversation, because you're actually bringing up something really important, and I think it warrants its own conversation. So what I want to say now is that the study group and these webinars are completely free because I have lovely people supporting me on Patreon. And so I'm able to give all of this in the spirit of the gift economy. So those of you who want to support me, you can find links to my Patreon account and do that, but that is not my motivation. So I hope we can continue these discussions and keep building so that we can learn to regenerate the earth together. And this specific topic of how do we cooperate well and how do we create functioning teams should be very evident as strategically central and important from what we saw today. And so please ask me more questions about this. Go and research it yourself. Lots of frameworks, tools, resources have been shared in my talk in the discussion section. And let's co-create together what we do from here. Because right now there's this window of opportunity to create new functioning groups as all of our old groups are breaking down and stalling out. I would love to see that by the time the next webinar occurs, that we formed a few of these groups. And so let's do this. There's no time to waste. And let's take the time we need to form the groups well. Thank you all, and thank you for being here. I really look forward to doing more of this together with all of you as we continue. And so wherever you are, I hope this is useful. And as I like to say, onward, fellow humans.